The fluorescent light above my desk has been flickering for 3 weeks now, casting these stuttering shadows that make everything look like it's moving when it shouldn't be. Tonight, something actually was. I work security at Millfield Industrial Complex, one of those sprawling warehouses on the outskirts of town where they store everything from car parts to discontinued furniture. It's the kind of place that feels abandoned even when it's fully operational during the day. At night, with just me and the humming machinery, it becomes something else entirely. The job pays well enough for what it is, sitting in a booth, watching monitors, making rounds every 2 hours. Simple work for a simple man, or at least that's what I told myself when I took it 6 months ago. What they don't mention in the job description is how the silence here isn't really silence at all. There's always something creaking, settling, breathing in the darkness beyond your flashlight beam. Tonight started like any other. I clocked in at 11, relieved Peterson from the day shift, and settled into my routine. The coffee was bitter. The monitors showed the usual empty corridors and storage bays, and the radio played that late-night talk show where people call in about UFO sightings and government conspiracies. Background noise to keep the loneliness at bay. The first sign something was wrong came around 1:30. I was making my rounds in Sector C when I heard it. A sound like metal scraping against concrete, slow and deliberate. I stopped walking and listened, but the sound stopped too. When I resumed my patrol, it started again, always seeming to come from just around the next corner, just beyond the reach of my flashlight. I told myself it was probably a loose piece of machinery, maybe a dolly someone forgot to secure properly. These old buildings shift and settle, especially in winter. Metal expands and contracts, making all sorts of noises. Perfectly reasonable explanation. But reasonable explanations don't account for the footprints I found in Sector D. They were in the dust on the floor, boot prints size 10 or 11, leading from the loading dock deeper into the warehouse. Fresh prints, the dust around them still settling. My flashlight beam followed them as they wound between the towering shelves, past pallets of boxed merchandise, into areas where no one should be walking at this hour. I called it into the main desk, but got no response. The radio crackled with static, then went dead. I tried my cell phone, but there was no signal. Not unusual in this concrete and steel maze. But tonight it felt different. Tonight it felt intentional. The footprints led me to Section J, a part of the warehouse I rarely visited. It housed older inventory, things that had been here so long they'd probably been written off as lost. The air smelled different here, stale and somehow thicker, like breathing through wet cloth. My flashlight seemed dimmer too, its beam barely penetrating the darkness between the shelves. That's when I saw him. He was standing at the far end of the aisle, maybe 40 feet away, perfectly still, just a silhouette in my peripheral vision, there and gone when I turned my light toward him. But I'd seen enough. A tall figure in what looked like coveralls, standing with his arms at his sides facing my direction. "Hey!" I called out, my voice echoing off the concrete walls. "This is a restricted area. You need to leave immediately." No response, no movement. When I stepped forward, flashlight raised, the space where he'd been standing was empty, but the air still held that thick, oppressive feeling, and now there was something else. A smell like old copper and damp earth. I should have left then. Should have returned to my booth, called the police, waited for backup. Instead, I followed the footprints deeper into Section J, past shelves that seemed to stretch impossibly high, beyond where my light could reach. The prints were clearer now, more defined, as if whoever was making them was pressing harder into the dust with each step. They ended at a wall. Not just any wall, this one was different from the others. While the rest of the warehouse was concrete block, this section was older brick, crumbling mortar, the kind of construction that suggested this building had been expanded over the years, built onto something that was already here. The footprints led right up to the wall and stopped, as if the person making them had simply walked through solid brick. I ran my flashlight over the surface, looking for a hidden door or passage. What I found instead were scratches in the mortar, deep gouges that looked like claw marks arranged in groups of 4. They covered the wall from floor to ceiling, thousands of them, overlapping and intersecting like some mad attempt to dig through solid stone. The scratching sound I'd been hearing all night suddenly made sense. As I stood there trying to process what I was seeing, I heard it again. That metal on concrete scraping, but now I could tell it wasn't metal at all. It was fingernails. Fingernails on brick, scraping, digging, trying to break through from the other side. The sound was coming from inside the wall. I stumbled backward, my flashlight beam dancing wildly across the scratched surface. The scraping grew louder, more frantic, accompanied now by a low moaning that seemed to vibrate through the floor and up into my bones. Other sounds joined it, multiple voices, all moaning, all scratching, all trying to claw their way through that ancient brick barrier. My flashlight went out. In the absolute darkness of Section J, surrounded by the sound of desperate scratching and inhuman moaning, I fumbled for my backup light. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely work the switch. When the beam finally cut through the blackness, illuminating that wall of scratches, I saw something that made my blood freeze. Fresh brick dust was raining down from the scratches. The mortar was crumbling, pieces falling to the floor with soft, pattering sounds. The wall was weakening, and whatever was on the other side was getting closer to breaking through. I ran through the maze of shelves, past pallets and boxes and machinery, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I tried to find my way back to the main corridor. Behind me, the moaning grew louder, more urgent, joined by new sounds, the rumble of shifting brick, the crack of breaking mortar, the whisper of something large moving through confined spaces. When I finally reached my security booth, I was gasping, covered in sweat despite the cold warehouse air. I grabbed the phone, dialed 911, and waited for what felt like hours for someone to answer. When they finally did, I tried to explain what I'd found. But how do you tell someone that there are things trapped behind a wall in an old warehouse? Things that have been scratching and clawing for God knows how long trying to get out? The police came, of course. 2 officers who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else, dealing with anything else. They followed me back to Section J, flashlights in hand, probably expecting to find evidence of a break-in or vandalism. What they found was an empty aisle and a perfectly normal concrete wall. No brick, no scratches, no signs that anyone had been there at all. They filed a report about a possible intruder, advised the company to check their security cameras, and left. I finished my shift in my booth, doors locked, radio turned up loud enough to drown out any sounds that might drift in from the darker parts of the warehouse. But I know what I saw, I know what I heard. And 3 days later, when I came in for my next shift, there was a memo from management. They'd decided to renovate Section J, update the storage systems, make better use of the space. Construction would begin immediately. I put in my 2 weeks' notice that night. Last week, I drove by the warehouse during the day, just curious about the construction progress. The parking lot was full of emergency vehicles, ambulances, fire trucks, police cars. I parked across the street and watched as they brought out the stretchers, one after another, covered in white sheets. The news report that evening was brief. Construction accident at Millfield Industrial Complex. 7 workers dead, cause unknown. The reporter mentioned that they'd been working on an old section of the building, removing a wall that had been part of the original structure from the 1940s. They found them behind that wall, 7 bodies in various states of decomposition, some decades old, all showing signs of desperate attempts to claw their way out. The medical examiner said they'd probably been sealed inside during the original construction, victims of some industrial accident that was covered up and forgotten. but I remember those footprints leading to the wall. I remember the fresh scratches in the mortar. I remember the sound of fingernails on brick coming from the other side. Whatever was behind that wall had been trying to get out for 70 years. And on my last night at Millfield Industrial Complex, they finally had help. Sometimes late at night when I'm trying to sleep, I still hear that scratching sound. It starts soft, almost like mice in the walls, then grows louder, more insistent. I tell myself it's just the old house settling, pipes expanding, normal sounds that every building makes. But deep down, I know better. Deep down, I know they followed me home. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more tales from the dark side. And let me know in the comments. Have you ever encountered something at work that you couldn't explain? I'd love to hear your stories. I tried to leave after that. Really tried. I packed my bags, loaded my car, even made it to the highway before the pain started. It felt like someone was driving nails into my skull, a sharp agony that grew worse the farther I got from the apartment. By the time I reached the city limits, I was doubled over the steering wheel, barely able to see through the tears streaming down my face. The pain stopped the moment I turned around and headed back to Elm Street. That was 2 weeks ago. Since then, I've stopped fighting it. The humming is louder now, but it doesn't bother me anymore. In fact, I've grown to love it. It's like having a constant companion, a gentle vibration that reminds me I'm never truly alone. My dreams have changed too. Now, instead of that underground tunnel, I dream about the apartment building, but from the inside out. I can see all the other units, all the other people lying in their beds, listening to their own customized frequencies. We're all connected now, part of something larger, something beautiful. Sometimes I catch myself humming along with the frequency during the day, and I notice other people in the building doing the same thing. We nod to each other in the hallways, a knowing smile passing between us. We understand each other in ways that words could never express. The frequency is teaching us a new way to communicate, a deeper connection than anything human language could provide. Soon, we won't need words at all. We'll speak in pure sound, pure vibration, pure understanding. Yesterday, I got a notice that they're expanding the building, adding new units to house the growing waiting list of people who want to live here. Apparently, word has gotten out about how peaceful and quiet our neighborhood is, how well people sleep here. They have no idea what they're signing up for, but that's okay. The frequency will teach them, just like it taught me, just like it's teaching all of us. And late at night, when the humming is strongest, I can hear them in the basement laboratory, making adjustments, fine-tuning the signal, preparing for the next phase of the project. I don't know what comes after integration, but I'm not worried. The frequency will guide us. The frequency knows what's best. The frequency loves us, and we love it back. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that will keep you up at night. And tell me in the comments, have you ever heard sounds in your home that you just couldn't explain? Sometimes the most innocent things can hide the darkest secrets. I started hearing it 3 months ago, just after I moved into the apartment on Elm Street. At first, I thought it was the neighbors. Maybe someone left a radio on, or there was interference from a cell tower. It was barely audible, a low humming that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The sound was always there, just at the edge of perception, like tinnitus but with a rhythm. It would pulse softly, almost like a heartbeat, rising and falling in slow waves that seemed to match my breathing when I paid attention to it. Most of the time I could ignore it, push it into the background noise of city living. But at night, when everything else went quiet, that humming became impossible to ignore. I tried everything: earplugs, white noise machines, even sleeping pills to knock me out deep enough that it wouldn't matter. Nothing worked. The sound wasn't coming through my ears. It was deeper than that, vibrating through my bones, resonating in my chest cavity, like I was standing inside a massive speaker. After 2 weeks of sleepless nights, I started keeping a journal, documenting when the sound was strongest, trying to find a pattern. What I discovered unsettled me more than the humming itself. The frequency changed based on where I was in the apartment. In the kitchen, it was barely noticeable, just a faint tremor at the very bottom of my hearing range. The living room was louder, a steady pulse that made my teeth ache after a few minutes. But the bedroom was where it reached its peak, a deep thrumming that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. I started spending my evenings in the kitchen, eating dinner standing at the counter, reading on my phone instead of watching TV in the living room. But eventually, everyone has to sleep, and sleep meant returning to that bedroom where the sound was strongest. That's when I started noticing the other changes. My dreams became incredibly vivid, but not in a good way. They were all the same dream, repeated night after night, with only minor variations. I would find myself standing in a vast underground space, like a subway tunnel that stretched infinitely in both directions. The walls were lined with speakers, thousands of them, all different sizes, all pulsing with that same low frequency I heard in my apartment. In the dream, I could see the sound waves rippling through the air like heat distortion, forming patterns that almost looked like writing in a language I didn't recognize. Other people were there too, standing motionless along the tunnel walls, their faces blank, their mouths slightly open as if they were singing along to a song only they could hear. I would try to speak to them, but no sound would come out. The frequency had grown so loud, it drowned out everything else, including my own voice. All I could do was stand there, watching the sound waves form their incomprehensible patterns, feeling that deep thrumming in my chest grow stronger and stronger until I woke up gasping. The dreams were always exactly 8 hours long. I know because I started timing them, setting my alarm for different intervals to see if I could wake up before they ended. But no matter when I set the alarm, 2 hours, 4 hours, 6 hours, I would always wake up naturally after exactly 8 hours, covered in sweat, with that humming sound even louder than before. After a month of this, I decided to do some research on the building. The apartment complex on Elm Street had been built in 1987, nothing unusual there. But the land it sat on had an interesting history. From 1962 to 1985, it had been the site of a research facility owned by a company called Resonance Dynamics. Most of the information about resonance dynamics was either classified or had been scrubbed from public records, but I managed to find a few newspaper articles from the early 80s. They were conducting acoustic research, something involving subsonic frequency manipulation for therapeutic applications. The articles were vague on details, but they mentioned several studies involving sleep patterns and neural frequency synchronization. The facility had been shut down abruptly in 1985, following what the news reports called a tragic accident during a late-night experiment. 23 researchers and test subjects had been found dead in the main laboratory, all showing signs of severe acoustic trauma. The official cause was listed as equipment malfunction, but the families of the victims sued, claiming the company had been conducting illegal human experiments. I found one more piece of information buried in a medical journal from 1986. Dr. Sarah Chen, one of the survivors from that night, had written a brief article about something she called frequency poisoning, prolonged exposure to specific low-frequency sound waves that could alter brain chemistry and sleep patterns. According to her research, certain frequencies could create a kind of addiction where the brain became dependent on the sound waves to function normally. The article mentioned that the affected frequencies were typically between 14 and 18 hertz, barely audible to most people, but capable of penetrating deep into the nervous system. Prolonged exposure could lead to what Dr. Chen termed auditory hallucinations, sleep disturbance, and progressive psychological deterioration. I bought a frequency detector the next day. The readings in my apartment were off the charts. The background frequency in the bedroom was 16.7 hertz, pulsing in a pattern that perfectly matched the rhythm I'd been hearing for months. But more disturbing was what the detector showed about the frequency's origin. It wasn't coming from outside the building. It wasn't coming from any electronic device or neighboring apartment. According to the readings, the source was directly below my bedroom floor, about 12 feet down in what should have been empty earth. I convinced my landlord to let me check the basement, claiming I was hearing water pipes and wanted to make sure there wasn't a leak. What I found down there changed everything. The basement was larger than it should have been, extending well beyond the footprint of the apartment building above. Most of it was empty space, concrete walls, and a few storage areas. But in the far corner, behind a door marked "Authorized Personnel Only," I found something that shouldn't have been there. It was a laboratory, or what was left of one. Banks of electronic equipment lined the walls, most of it dark and covered in dust. But some of the machines were still running, their displays glowing softly in the dim light. And at the center of the room, built into the floor itself, was a massive speaker array, dozens of subwoofers arranged in a circular pattern, all aimed upward toward the apartments above. The frequency detector in my hand was going crazy, the readings jumping between 15 and 18 hertz in a pattern that seemed almost alive. But it was the logbook I found on one of the desks that truly terrified me. The entries went back 23 years, documenting something called Project Resonance. The goal, according to the notes, was to test the long-term effects of subsonic frequency exposure on human subjects without their knowledge. The apartment building had been designed specifically for this purpose, with the laboratory hidden beneath it and speakers built into the walls of selected units. My apartment was Unit 23, the same number as the people who had died in that original accident. The logbook entries detailed everything: sleep pattern disruption, dream manipulation, progressive psychological effects. There were notes about how the frequencies could be adjusted to create specific responses, how different patterns could induce everything from mild anxiety to complete psychological breakdown. But the most disturbing part was the final entry, dated just 3 months ago, right around the time I moved in. Subject 23C has begun showing expected responses to frequency exposure, sleep patterns disrupted, vivid dreaming reported, proceeding to phase 2 of conditioning protocol. Estimated time to complete integration, 90 days. 90 days, 3 months. Today marked exactly 3 months since I'd started hearing the humming. I tried to run then, tried to get back upstairs and pack my things and leave, but something was wrong. The frequency had changed, grown louder, more insistent. My legs felt heavy, uncoordinated, like I was walking through thick syrup. The humming filled my skull, drowning out my thoughts, making it impossible to focus on anything except that deep, rhythmic pulse. I made it as far as the stairway before I collapsed. When I woke up, I was back in my bedroom, lying on top of the covers, fully clothed. The frequency detector was gone, and when I checked my phone, it showed that 3 days had passed. 3 days I couldn't remember. 3 days that were simply gone. But I remember the dreams from those missing days. I remember standing in that underground tunnel, surrounded by other people who all looked like they were sleepwalking. I remember the sound waves forming those strange patterns on the walls, and this time I could almost understand what they were saying. They were instructions, commands, a new language being written directly into our subconscious minds while we slept. My son stopped being my son on a Tuesday in October, but I didn't realize it until 3 weeks later, when I found him eating the neighbor's cat in our basement. The change had been so gradual, so subtle, that I'd convinced myself it was just part of growing up. Tommy was 8 after all, and 8-year-olds go through phases. They become secretive, moody, different from the cheerful children they used to be. That's what I told myself when he stopped wanting to play catch in the backyard. That's what I told myself when he started spending hours in his room with the door locked, making soft scratching sounds that I assumed were him drawing or building with his Legos. But looking back now, I can see all the signs I missed. All the little moments when I should have known that the boy living in my house wasn't the same boy I'd tucked into bed every night for 8 years. It started with his appetite. Tommy had always been a picky eater, the kind of kid who would rather go hungry than eat vegetables, who survived mainly on chicken nuggets and mac and cheese. But after that Tuesday in October, the day he came home from school an hour late with mud on his clothes and a strange, distant look in his eyes, he began eating everything I put in front of him. Not just eating it, but devouring it with an intensity that was almost disturbing to watch. He would sit at the dinner table hunched over his plate, shoveling food into his mouth with his hands instead of using his fork. When I told him to slow down, to use his utensils like a civilized person, he would look up at me with these blank eyes and nod, then go back to eating with his hands the moment I looked away. I thought maybe he was going through a growth spurt. Kids do that sometimes. They eat like they haven't seen food in weeks, their bodies demanding fuel for some internal change that adults can't see or understand. I started buying more groceries, making larger portions, telling myself it was normal for a growing boy to have such an enormous appetite. But it wasn't just the amount of food he was eating, it was the way he ate it. I first noticed it with the meat. Tommy had always preferred his hamburgers well done, almost burnt. But now he asked for them rare, then barely cooked. Then one night I caught him in the kitchen at 2 a.m, eating raw ground beef directly from the package with his bare hands, the red juice running down his chin and dripping onto his pajamas. When I turned on the light and demanded to know what he was doing, he froze like a deer in headlights, a handful of raw meat halfway to his mouth. For just a moment, his eyes reflected the kitchen light like an animal's, a bright yellow-green that made my blood run cold. "I was hungry," he said in that flat, monotone voice he'd developed over the past few weeks. "I couldn't sleep." I took the meat away, threw it in the garbage, and sent him back to bed with a lecture about food safety and salmonella poisoning. But as I watched him walk up the stairs, I noticed something else that was wrong. Tommy had always been clumsy, always tripping over his own feet or bumping into furniture. Now he moved with a fluid grace that seemed unnatural for a child his age, like he was floating just slightly above the ground. The scratching sounds from his room got worse after that night. They would start around midnight and continue until dawn. Soft, rhythmic scraping like fingernails on wood. When I asked him about it, he claimed he didn't know what I was talking about. When I checked his room during the day, I couldn't find any evidence of what might be making the noise. But his fingernails were always dirty now, black grime packed underneath them that soap couldn't wash away, and they were growing faster than fingernails should grow, requiring trimming almost every other day instead of once a week like before. The really disturbing changes started in his 3rd week of being different. Tommy had always been a social child, constantly asking when he could have friends over or go to other kids' houses to play. But now he showed no interest in other children at all. When I suggested calling his best friend Marcus to see if he wanted to come over, Tommy just stared at me with those increasingly strange eyes and said, "I don't like Marcus anymore. I don't like any of them." Instead, he started showing an unusual interest in animals. He would spend hours sitting perfectly still in the backyard, watching birds and squirrels with an intensity that made me uncomfortable. Once, I saw him catch a mouse that had been living in our garage, holding it gently in his cupped hands while it struggled to escape. I expected him to let it go, Tommy had always been tender-hearted about small creatures, but instead, he brought it inside and asked if he could keep it as a pet. I said no, told him to release it outside, but the next morning I found the mouse in a shoebox in his closet. It was dead, but not in any way that made sense. There were no obvious injuries, no signs of violence, but its eyes were gone and there were small bite marks around its neck that looked disturbingly human. When I confronted Tommy about it, he seemed genuinely confused. "It must have died during the night," he said with that same flat effect. "Maybe it was sick." But I saw him lick his lips when he said it, and there was something dark stuck between his teeth. I started watching him more carefully after that, trying to catch him in whatever he was doing during those long hours in his room. I installed a nanny cam hidden in a stuffed animal on his bookshelf, thinking I would finally get some answers about the scratching sounds and his increasingly bizarre behavior. What I captured on that camera still haunts my dreams. The footage showed Tommy lying in bed until approximately midnight, apparently asleep. Then, without any transitional movement, he would suddenly sit up, fully alert, and turn his head towards the camera with those yellow-green eyes reflecting the infrared light. He seemed to know exactly where the camera was hidden, and he would stare directly into it for several minutes, with an expression that was definitely not my 8-year-old son. Then he would get out of bed and drop to his hands and knees on the floor. The scratching sounds were him digging, using his fingernails to claw at the hardwood, creating small grooves and gouges that somehow disappeared by morning. But more disturbing than the digging was the way he moved while he did it. His limbs bent at angles that shouldn't have been possible. His spine curved and twisted as he worked, making him look less like a child and more like some sort of large insect. And his mouth was open the entire time, revealing teeth that seemed too sharp, too numerous, too crowded into his small jaw. The footage from the third night showed him successfully digging through the floor. A hole appeared beneath his bed, just large enough for a child to fit through, leading down into the crawl space beneath the house. Tommy disappeared into that hole around 1 a.m. and didn't emerge until just before dawn, climbing back up with dirt under his fingernails and something dark smeared around his mouth. I confronted him at breakfast the next morning, demanding to know what he was doing in the crawl space. He looked at me with those alien eyes and smiled, the first genuine expression I'd seen from him in weeks. "Playing," he said. "I found some friends down there." That afternoon, while Tommy was at school, I went into the crawl space myself with a flashlight and a crowbar, determined to find out what was happening under my own house. What I discovered there made me understand that whatever was living in my home, it wasn't my son. The crawl space had been expanded somehow. What should have been a narrow gap between the foundation and the floor joists had been carved out into a series of tunnels that extended far beyond the footprint of the house. The walls were lined with bones, small animal bones at first, mice and rats and birds. But deeper in the tunnels, I found larger remains, cat skulls, dog rib cages, and in the deepest chamber, arranged in a perfect circle around what looked like a crude altar, were 7 child-sized skeletons. But it was what I found next to the altar that made me run screaming from that underground maze. It was a pile of clothes, neatly folded and stacked like laundry waiting to be put away. Children's clothes in various sizes, some so old they were falling apart, others that looked brand new. At the top of the pile was a small t-shirt I recognized immediately, red with a cartoon dinosaur on the front. Tommy's favorite shirt that he'd been wearing the day he came home late, with mud on his clothes. My real son's shirt. I drove to the school in a panic, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the steering wheel. I had to see Tommy, had to look at him in the harsh fluorescent light of his classroom and convince myself that I was losing my mind, that the thing living in my house really was my boy, and I was just being paranoid. But when I arrived at Jefferson Elementary and asked to see my son, the secretary gave me a confused look. "I'm sorry, Mr. Davidson, but Tommy hasn't been to school in over 3 weeks. We've been calling your house, but no one ever answers. We were about to send someone to check on you." 3 weeks, the exact amount of time since Tommy had started acting strange. The exact amount of time since something else had been living in my house, sleeping in my son's bed, eating at my table, pretending to be the child I loved more than life itself. I raced home, my mind spinning with possibilities that all led to the same horrible conclusion. I burst through the front door, calling Tommy's name, but the house was empty. He should have been home from school by now. Whatever he was should have been home by now, but there was no sign of him anywhere, except for the basement. I could hear sounds coming from down there, wet tearing noises mixed with that soft, rhythmic scratching I'd grown to dread. I grabbed a baseball bat from the closet and slowly made my way down the wooden steps, each creak seeming to echo through the house like a gunshot. The basement lights were off, but there was illumination coming from somewhere, a sickly yellow-green glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. In that unnatural light, I could see the thing that had been pretending to be my son crouched in the far corner, hunched over something that had once been alive. It looked like Tommy from behind, same size, same hair color, same clothes. But when it turned to face me, alerted by my footsteps on the stairs, I saw what it really was. The face was wrong. The features were almost right, close enough to fool someone who wasn't looking carefully. But the proportions were off in ways that made my eyes water to look at directly. The mouth was too wide, stretching almost from ear to ear, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that were stained red. The eyes were those yellow-green orbs I'd seen reflecting in the darkness, but now they were bright enough to cast their own light. And the hands weren't human at all. They ended in long, curved claws that were perfect for digging, perfect for tearing, perfect for the kind of work I'd seen evidence of in the crawlspace tunnels. "Hello, Daddy," it said in Tommy's voice, but the words seemed to come from somewhere else, like a recording played through a broken speaker. "I was just having dinner. Would you like some?" It gestured with one clawed hand toward the thing it had been eating, and I saw enough to know it had once been Mrs. Patterson's tabby cat before I had to look away. "Where is my son?" I managed to whisper, though part of me already knew the answer. The thing tilted its head with a motion that was too fluid, too snake-like for anything human. "I am your son," it said, and for just a moment its face shifted, becoming more recognizably Tommy's features. "I've always been your son. Don't you love me anymore, Daddy?" But the illusion only lasted a second before the true face emerged again, alien and predatory and hungry. "I know what you are," I said, raising the baseball bat with hands that shook so badly I could barely maintain my grip. "I know you're not Tommy. Where is he? What did you do with my real son?" The creature's grin widened impossibly further, revealing even more teeth than should have been able to fit in any mouth. "Your real son is safe," it hissed. "He's sleeping in the deep tunnels, dreaming beautiful dreams while we decide if we want to keep him or trade him for something better. But you don't need to worry about that anymore." It began to move toward me then, not walking, but flowing across the basement floor like liquid shadow. I swung the bat, but it passed through empty air as the thing seemed to dissolve and reform just inches from my face. "You see, Daddy, we've been watching your family for a very long time, watching and waiting for the right moment to make our trade. And now that we have what we want, we don't need you anymore." The last thing I remember clearly is those yellow-green eyes filling my vision and a sound like whispers in a language that predated human speech, then darkness and dreams of tunnels that stretched down into the earth forever, filled with the soft crying of children who would never see sunlight again. I woke up in my own bed 3 days later, with no memory of how I'd gotten there. The basement was clean, no sign of the creature or its meal. Tommy's room was exactly as it had always been, his clothes in the dresser, his toys arranged neatly on the shelves. But Tommy was gone. The police found no evidence of foul play, no signs of forced entry or struggle. As far as they were concerned, my son had simply vanished. Another tragic case for their missing children files. They questioned me extensively, but what could I tell them? That something inhuman had been impersonating my child for 3 weeks, while the real Tommy was imprisoned in tunnels beneath my house. I tried to find those tunnels again, spent days digging in the crawl space with shovels and pickaxes, but they were gone. The earth beneath my house was solid, undisturbed, as if the elaborate network of chambers and passages had never existed at all. That was 6 months ago. I've moved twice since then, each time to a different state, but it doesn't matter. They follow me wherever I go, not the creature that impersonated Tommy. I think that one served its purpose and moved on to some other family, some other father who won't notice the gradual changes in his child until it's too late. But the others, the ones who sent it, they're still watching me, still deciding what to do with the man who saw too much, who knows their secret. I see them sometimes in my peripheral vision, child-shaped shadows that disappear when I turn to look directly at them. They stand at the edges of playgrounds, watching the real children play, studying their movements and mannerisms like actors preparing for a role. Sometimes I try to warn the parents, try to tell them to watch their kids more carefully, but they just think I'm crazy. Maybe I am crazy. Maybe grief and guilt have finally broken my mind completely, and everything I remember about those 3 weeks is just an elaborate delusion, constructed to explain why I failed to protect my son. The therapists certainly think so. They have terms for what I'm experiencing: dissociative episodes, paranoid ideation, complicated grief response. But the scratching sounds follow me to every new apartment. The yellow-green eyes watching from dark corners never go away. And sometimes, late at night, when I'm lying awake listening to those soft, rhythmic noises in the walls, I hear something else. I hear Tommy calling for me. His voice drifts up from somewhere deep beneath whatever building I'm sleeping in, muffled and distant, but unmistakably his. He's asking me to come find him, to dig deeper, to not give up searching for the tunnels that will lead me back to where they're keeping him. I know it's probably just another trick, another way for them to lure me into whatever trap they've prepared. But it's my son's voice, and every time I hear it, a part of me wants to grab a shovel and start digging, no matter how deep I have to go. Because what if he's really down there? What if somewhere in the darkness beneath our feet, Tommy is still alive, still waiting for his father to save him? What if this time, when I hear him calling, I'm supposed to answer? The scratching is getting louder now. It's almost time. I think tonight might be the night I finally start digging again. Hit that like button if this story gave you chills, and make sure you're subscribed for more tales that will make you question everything you think you know about the world around you. Drop a comment and tell me, have you ever noticed your child acting differently, even in small ways that you couldn't quite explain? Sometimes the most innocent changes can hide the darkest truths.